Welcome to this morning's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website and sent to those who registered for the event. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Patrick Costello, over to you.
Great, thank you, Annie. Good afternoon from Washington. I'm Patrick Costello, the CEO of the American Security Project. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual meeting. There's been a sharp rise in tensions between Ukraine and Russia in recent weeks. The tensions have prompted Kiev to fear that Moscow is preparing for an invasion. This week, we had NATO foreign ministers meeting in Riga to address the matter. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called for NATO countries to be, quote, prepared for the worst. Just yesterday, Secretary Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met and expressed seemingly irreconcilable positions prior to and following their meeting. We could be on the brink of a very serious crisis, maybe the worst crisis in Europe in decades. And I am quite honored to be joined this afternoon by Ambassador Steve Pifer and Dr. Evelyn Farkas. They both have extensive experience looking at Russia, Ukraine, and European security. Steve is currently affiliated with the Friedman Spogge Institute out at Stanford, and his distinguished public service career has included serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the EUR Bureau with responsibility over Russia and Ukraine. He also served as our ambassador in Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. He did a tour on the NSC staff as the Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Evelyn is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Her most recent government service was in the Pentagon, serving as the DASD for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. She also served in senior roles advising the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, as well as the Secretary of Defense. And once upon a time, she was a senior fellow with the American Security Project. So Evelyn, it's truly a pleasure to welcome you back to ASP. As Annie mentioned, this conversation is going to be on the record. We'll record it, post it on our website. I'm going to engage Steve and Evelyn in conversation for several minutes to start off the program, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. When we get to that point, I'd encourage you to use the Q&A function in your Zoom window to submit your inquiries, and then I'll pose them to Steve and Evelyn. So Steve, I'm just going to pose the first one to you. Why don't you just give us a situation update? Tell us where things stand now, what we know about Russia's military movements, their readiness, just set the scene for what's happening on Ukraine's frontier.
Yes, well, the reports are that there are between 100 and 125,000 Russian troops that are either on or have moved close to Ukraine's borders. And this buildup has been taking place for several weeks. Now, in some ways, it mirrors what happened back in April when we saw a similar buildup, although nothing happened in April. But I think there are some more worrisome signs now. One is that the movements in April were much more open. Some of these seem to be covert. Second, you have had, I think, a worsening of relations between Moscow and Kyiv over the last 6 months. You've had this rather astonishing essay that Vladimir Putin published back in July on Ukraine, which basically denies Ukraine legitimacy as a sovereign state. Former President Medvedev in October said it's pointless to try to talk to Kyiv. You've had an unprecedented level of rhetoric coming out of Moscow almost on a daily basis. I mean, I think yesterday Moscow was saying that there's half the Ukrainian army now is deployed to attack Donbass, which I think is total fiction. So you have this, and the question now is, and the other thing that you've seen is the level of concern being expressed by Washington, but also by key NATO allies and NATO itself is far higher than was the case in April. So I think this is seen as qualitatively different from 6 months ago. And the big question is, what does Vladimir Putin intend? You know, is this a bluff designed to unnerve Kyiv, designed to rattle the West, or does he actually plan to send the Russian military into Ukraine? And my guess is at this point, perhaps Vladimir Putin hasn't decided. I mean, he likes to have options. And from, I think, the Moscow point of view, using this kind of the fear of a possible military action to achieve its objectives with Kyiv and with NATO would be the desirable route. But we don't really know. I look at the potential cost to Russia of a military action against Ukraine. And I think both in terms of the Western response, but also in terms of the Ukrainian military, which is far better than it was in 2014. I mean, the Russians would pay a price. There's little doubt that the Russians would win. But how would the Russian public respond to Russian soldiers coming home in body bags? So I look at these costs and say, at the end of the day, it's not likely that Putin's going to launch a military operation. But having said that, that's my logic, looking at the situation from 5,000–6,000 miles away. And I'll be the first to admit that I've not always been the best predictor of Vladimir Putin's logic. So I think it's important now for the West to be doing all it can to signal to the Russians that there would indeed be heavy costs for military action against Ukraine.
Great, thanks, Steve. Evelyn, how do you interpret Russia's actions? Evelyn, you're present.
Sorry, yeah, there's really not a lot of daylight between the good ambassador and myself. And I should say again, thank you, Patrick, for giving me this opportunity. And it's always great to be back with ASP. The first think tank I went to, I think, after I left government in 2009 rather. So I would say, again, like I said, there's not much daylight between myself and Steve. The way that Vladimir Putin has operated in the past, we've seen it before. Indeed, we've seen it when he invaded Ukraine. We have very good evidence that it wasn't as if he had decided months in advance that he was going to invade Ukraine. He had preparations. He had a military that was prepared to conduct a lightning strike into Crimea to seize the territory or to seize any other territory. But we don't believe that he was planning that deliberately in advance. And we were, in fact, of course, surprised by his decision to attack. It's no different now, and it wasn't any different in April. I think the question is, how much risk, how much danger is Putin willing to absorb? He's a high risk taking leader, but as Steve said, I mean, this time around, it's much more dangerous for the Russian soldiers, but that may also mean that Putin sees the balance shifting because the Ukrainians have been acquiring drones from Turkey, and so some of the military balance, it's not shifting in, against Russia. Again, as Steve said, ultimately Russia would win, but maybe Putin thinks he has to strike now and get some more territory or cause some more trouble as a way of getting a bargaining chip. So he may take military action just to bargain, or he may be prevented because we somehow offer him something, although I'm not quite sure what we could offer him to really truly satisfy him. It may be for domestic consumption as well, and we can get into that later.
Okay, well, let's reflect back on what happened in April. There were massive military exercises, again, approximately 100,000 troops along the Ukrainian frontier. They were then pulled back, but my understanding was a lot of the infrastructure was left in place. So, Steve, I guess to you, the degree to which you think or disagree with this, certainly, that what happened in April was a precursor for what's happening today.
Well, I think certainly you're right. I mean, a lot of the troops left after April, but a lot of the infrastructure remained in place. So it made it easier for the Russians to return forces this time, and probably made it easier for them to do it in a way that was not as visible as was the case back in April, because there was always already established infrastructure. So I think that's one of the issues here. And again, looking back at April, it was the Russians were engaging in military exercises. A lot of the movements were in fact announced. And what I think has some people worried now is you're not seeing those sorts of announcements now. There seems to be more of an effort than we saw back in April to cover the scale of the Russian buildup around Ukraine.
Evelyn, would you largely agree with Steve's assessment there?
Yes, I think what's more disconcerting, Steve mentioned the recent paper that Vladimir Putin put out. Essentially, you use the word revanchist in the announcement or the title of this talk today, or this panel today, and one of the people in the chat actually asked what's revanchist. He's basically making an argument that Ukraine is not a state, doesn't deserve to be a state separate from Russia, should be part of the Russian Federation. And that, I think, is unsettling, because that does harken back to the argument that he made back in 2014, just as he was invading, or right after he'd invaded Crimea. some of you might remember seeing on television, Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, with the gold, and he gave a big speech, which was very historical and very, very out of sync with the current international system, which is one where we respect borders, we respect the borders that were agreed upon at the end of the Second World War, and we don't go back in history and try to recreate empires and spheres of influence. But that is exactly what Vladimir Putin is saying, more or less, in this new paper, and that's alarming.
Let me add one other factor that I think is of concern, which is I don't believe Vladimir Putin understands Ukrainians. A couple of examples. I mean, if you look at the policy that he has pursued over the last 7 years, it's a huge strategic failure for Moscow. Nothing has done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than what Putin has done in the last 7 years. But, does he understand Ukraine? The last time he was in Kyiv was in 2013. He was there to mark the 1025th anniversary of Kievan Rus. This is the founding state that both Russia and Ukraine claim. And that was when the founding state accepted Christianity. And that, of course, had huge implications for religion, both in Russia and Ukraine. But he gave a speech, and one of the themes which he repeats continuously is, we Russians and Ukrainians are a single people. And that's a very, that's a tone deaf speech to give in Ukraine, because for a large segment of the Ukrainian population, what they hear is, you've denied my culture, my language, my history. And he repeats that. Likewise, if you go back to 2014, you may recall that for a period, the Russians were talking about Novorossiya, this concept that the eastern and southern Ukraine would rise up against Kyiv. And by April, May, it was clear that was not going to happen. But in Moscow, that idea continued to float around in high levels, for another 5 or 6 months. So I do worry that the Kremlin, that Vladimir Putin does not understand Ukraine, and that they may miscalculate and they may not understand how much I believe the Ukrainians would resist. I think the Ukrainian army would fight. And to the extent that Russia achieved initial success and occupied more Ukrainian territory, I think that they would find themselves confronted with a guerrilla conflict.
Yeah, and I think if I can add on to that, that is an important distinction, because the Russians may have the political will at the highest levels and the military power, but essentially the Ukrainian people are animated by the need to defend their territory and their nation in a way that's very different from the Russian people. The Russian people don't want to fight with the Ukrainian people. So that's an important distinction in addition.
Great. And as my ASP colleagues have noted in the chat function, if you do want to pose questions, please use the Q&A function. Just before we get to audience questions, I want to take a step back. And it strikes me that the concerns about Ukraine are taking place in a broader geopolitical context. So how much is this is really about Ukraine? How much is about Russia's place in the broader geopolitical order and Putin wanting direct dialogue on the broader European security agenda? So Steve, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, no, I think you've touched on a key point, is you're not going to resolve the conflict in Donbass, I believe, without having some kind of a broader dialogue on broader European security architecture questions. Where does Ukraine fit in, things like that? Now, again, what Vladimir Putin has said the last couple of days is not encouraging. I mean, he's basically demanded legal guarantees from NATO that NATO will enlarge no more. There is no way that NATO is going to give that. I mean, that would require a consensus among NATO allies, and you're not going to get, many, if certainly not a consensus of allies to agree to reduce a NATO policy that goes back to the 1990s. Now, he's also said, I don't want to see certain types of military infrastructure in Ukraine. He's talked about American missiles there. Maybe you could do something on that, because there's no intention on the American side to put any kind of strike missiles into Ukraine. But some of the demands he seems to be indicating are just way too far. Now, if there's a more realistic approach, maybe you could address some of these questions. NATO and Ukraine are a tough issue, but I would note that 8 years ago, when you asked Ukrainians, do you want to join NATO, maybe 25 to 30% said yes. Now, after 7 years of war with Russia, pluralities and majorities, the last poll said 58% of Ukrainians want to join NATO. Congratulations, Mr. Putin, your policy is really working. But you could have a conversation on that. It'll be a hard conversation. I mean, the idea I thought of in the past is maybe you handle the issue of Ukrainian membership data by saying, not now, but not never. Push that issue down the road to try to diffuse it. So there could be a conversation, but whether or not that kind of approach would be acceptable to the Russians, I don't know. They seem to be making demands that are actually upping the ante at a time when they should be looking for a way to sort of de-escalate things.
On that, not now, but not never, isn't that effectively what was stated in the Bucharest at the Bucharest summit in 2008? Evelyn, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's what I was thinking. That is our policy. It's pretty much not now, but not never. It's the same with Georgia. It's frankly the same with a lot of other countries that are waiting in the Balkans, Bosnia, Serbia, perhaps, although they have their own Putin problem too. But so I don't think that's going to necessarily be the key to resolving the current crisis. I do agree, however, with Steve that there might be some kind of compromise we can make. We always drew the line that when we were providing assistance to Ukraine, military assistance, it would include training that would be defensive, and all of the weaponry would also be defensive. And for a long time, we didn't even provide lethal defensive weaponry, which both Steve and I are on the record, myself in the administration, opposing that decision. And ultimately, the United States reversed it, and we do now provide lethal defensive weaponry to Ukraine. As you provide more weapons to Ukraine and different classes of weapons, it becomes a little bit harder to make that distinction. And maybe we can work with the Russians, because we don't want to create a situation where the Ukrainians are tempted into using force, but we want to make sure that the Russians are deterred from using force. And so there may be a place there, but ultimately I think this Kremlin and Vladimir Putin is going to continue to be threatened by Ukraine so long as Ukraine looks like it's becoming more democratic and offering a different model for the Russian people.
Let
me second what Evelyn just said there. A successful Ukraine, a Ukraine that builds on the democracy that it achieves, and if the Ukrainians could get the economy right, a growing economy that begins to realize the country's potential, and you see rising living standards, in a way that's a nightmare for the Kremlin, because then you have Russians saying, why can't we have the same political voice that they have in Ukraine? And the Kremlin fears that sort of thing. They don't want to see a successful Ukraine on their border.
Yeah, because in fact, the reason the Ukrainians, one of the reasons why they rose up in 2014 against their, Kremlin-controlled leader, Yanukovych, was because they looked at Poland and said, wait a minute, we used to be richer, and stronger than Poland, and they're really wealthy now and have outpaced us.
Right. One of the things that strikes me is there is a material difference between the situation on the ground in 2014 and the situation on the ground today, and that is that we are providing the Ukrainians with lethal assistance. I remember watching those debates unfold on the outside. Evelyn, you were part of it on the inside. So can you just kind of unpack what we have provided them in terms of military kit and the like?
So across the United States policy, and this is not necessarily a NATO policy, there may be NATO members providing lethal assistance, small amounts. I could imagine weaponry being provided to Ukraine by NATO allies, especially those closer to them in proximity. But for the United States, we were very determined that we wanted to defend Ukraine, as I said before, but not do anything to escalate the situation so as to quote unquote provoke Russia. And I don't like the term provoke because oftentimes people misuse it and they call deterrence a provocation, which is not the case. To have a strong defense is actually the best way not to provoke, to deter Russia. So the javelins, there was a lot of discussion about whether they're basically anti-tank weapons. They're not, you can't, run across a border offensively and lob them at, to start a war. In effect, they work at precision targeting of tanks that are coming over the horizon at you. And frankly speaking, they would cause a great deal of damage, a body count, to the Russians. And we did see inside the US government, and actually it was public, that the Russians were very sensitive to body bags going home. They clamped down on journalists. They actually beat them up, journalists in Russia who were covering the dead who were coming back from Russia. They went and, told all the family members of the casualties of the fallen to be quiet, and all the burials were done sort of in the cover of the night. So we knew there was a sensitivity, and that sensitivity continues to this day, because as I said earlier, the Russian people don't really want another war like Afghanistan, and that illusion is there because of the potential for guerrilla warfare, but they also don't want a war with the Ukrainian people. So ultimately, I think we need to look at what we're providing Ukraine to make sure we're still deterring Russia. I think the drones from Turkey, they are a good deterrent capability. We just need to keep careful watch to make sure that the military balance is not impacted such that the Russians think that they can't prevail if they went offensive. We still need to deter them so they know if they went offensive, we could kill everything on the ground. And so, which means we could increase air surveillance. And we haven't done as much to help the Ukrainians rather in maritime and in the air domains.
I want to pivot away from the troop buildup a bit and get your assessment of anything that's happening in the digital domain. Have we seen an uptick in what we used to call active measures activities, anything in the cyber domain? Steve, have you seen anything there?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can say there's been an uptick. I mean, I think the Ukrainians believe that they've been fairly continually under cyber attack and under Russian disinformation attacks. So, but what I don't know is whether it's been ratcheted up now as opposed to just the normal level of hybrid conflict that they see the Russians waging against them.
And I would agree with that. And let's not forget, for people watching here, I believe it was 2015, the Russians launched a cyber attack against Ukraine that took out the electricity for about 250,000 Ukrainian people. So the Russians have basically exercised, they've practiced techniques they would use even against the United States if they considered themselves at war with us on the Ukrainian people. And they've continued to do that from day one. And of course, all of the disinformation campaigns, they have been actively called out by the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian civilians with regard to disinformation about vaccines. So they're really doing things that are quite detrimental, not just to confidence of the Ukrainian people in their government, but frankly, to the day-to-day physical well-being of Ukrainians.
I want to kind of play out how this thing could really spiral out of control, because crises are unpredictable. Like, what could really tip this over the edge? What would cause this thing to really take off in an unexpected fashion? Evelyn, if you're sitting back and advising the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy on what indicates things will spiral, and Steve, if you're putting on your old NSC hat, just if you could game that out. I'll go to Evelyn first on that.
I mean, I think one of the things that we always look at is what are the Russians saying? Because they do speak out of both sides of their mouth and they'll deny, but they'll also telegraph oftentimes what they're about to do. And usually they do that by saying the other side's doing it. So, the more they say that the Ukrainians are getting ready to launch a war against Russia, the more you can be sure that they're considering launching a war against Ukraine. So I think that's one thing. Obviously, you have to look very closely at their military movements, but also how that's working in conjunction with the public comments, the cyber activity. So I think those are important. And I'll stop there and turn it to Steve.
Yeah, I guess I'd add two things. I would agree with Evelyn. Watch the level of rhetoric that's coming out of Moscow, which again I think has ratcheted way up over the last couple of weeks. Although it was interesting, I was in a conversation a couple of days ago, and somebody made a very interesting observation. As they said, if you look at the rhetoric from Moscow, they said the missing piece so far, and I have to confess I have not followed Russian state media close enough to agree or disagree with this, but they said the missing piece is that the Kremlin really has not done anything to prepare the Russian public for a war in which, again, I think there would be a significant number of Russian casualties. Now, that may reflect a Kremlin miscalculation that they will be greeted as liberators when they move into parts of Ukraine. I think that's completely wrong. And again, as we both said, the Russians likely prevail in the end, but it's going to be at significant cost. The other thing, though, I would also watch is, again, in addition to the buildup, and this gets into sort of specifics that are kind of beyond my level of military knowledge, but are the Russians mounting the logistics necessary to sustain a large-scale operation? And I think that traditionally has been serving as sort of a weaker point for the Russians. But if they're truly planning a large operation, some say they might try to take all of Ukraine up to the Dnipro River. there would have to be, I think, a significant amount of logistics pre-positioned to support that kind of operation.
On that last point, Evelyn, you're the military planner amongst us. Are you seeing any evidence of that logistical positioning?
Well, I'm a policy person, not a military planner, but
Oh, fair.
so I don't want to oversell. I don't want to let you oversell me.
You're the Pentagon person.
Yeah, but so I don't obviously have access to the intelligence. I do, from the open source media accounts, I do believe that they are ready logistically. This is a case also where it's not that hard for them. They're right on the border. It's not Syria. And they surprised us by how good they were at creating and then maintaining a logistical chain to Syria from Russia. So this logistics into Ukraine is not hard. The other part of it, I think that's been unsettling to me, frankly, has been the activity on the Belarusian-Polish border and the pressure on Belarus, because that also helps them logistically. So there is definitely a military implication to all of that political wrangling and Russia's involvement in the pressure on the Polish-Belarusian border and on Belarus itself.
So looking forward, we had the Ukrainian defense minister telling Ukrainian parliamentarians just yesterday, or maybe it was even today, that Russia could invade sometime near the end of January. If we're looking at some type of time frame for escalation, does that seem right to you? I'll go to Steve first.
Yeah, I mean, some people have said that January, February is a better time frame because the winter set in, and the ground's solid. They don't have to worry about maneuvering heavy armor and other units through marshy areas and such. But again, I think Putin likes to have options. Putin may not have decided, and to the extent that there's a longer time frame, Putin is going to be watching to see how the West reacts. And from the Kremlin's point of view, the ideal outcome would be that there's a cave by Kyiv and a cave by the West to the threat of Russian use of force without the Russians having to actually use force. I think actually, though, this is a time where the West should be doing everything it can to communicate to the Kremlin the sorts of political and economic costs that would ensue if the Russians were to go into Ukraine.
That's right, and I would add to that, if I were a military planner, I would be sitting with my political analysts, looking at what dates are significant in Russian history in January, February, or really December, January, February, because the Kremlin loves, and Putin in particular, loves to use these historical dates to telegraph, a message of Russian strength when he's engaging in military operations.
Then let me give you two dates right. This month, December 8, of course, will be the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Belozhsk Accord in Belarus, which actually was basically Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. And of course, December 25 was the date where Mikhail Gorbachev formally conceded and the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin and the Russian tricolor was raised. So a couple of earlier dates to watch.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's certainly hope that we don't get a Christmas surprise there. But the December 8th date kind of strikes me. That's just next week. There's talk of a Putin-Biden conversation. Would it almost make sense to align that dialogue with December 8th? Steve?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because by appearances, the Russians do want to have both a virtual conversation between Putin and Biden, and then also there's talk of a possible face-to-face meeting early in the next year. Now, I do hope that, and that is an opportunity to try to look at some ways to diffuse the current crisis. Although I think it's important, the Russians would like this to be Washington and Moscow settling all these questions without the intervention of the pesky Ukrainians and the pesky Europeans. That's a trap for us. We need to avoid that. Now, we can have that dialogue, but it's also, this is an issue that we have to solve with the Ukrainians at the table, ultimately, with the Europeans there. It has to be, it can't be just a bilateral dialogue with Moscow. But the fact that the Russians want this, I think, again, gives the Washington a bit of leverage. I wouldn't overinflate it. But there has to be, I think, a recognition in Moscow that nothing kills that summit meeting more quickly than a Russian military incursion into Ukraine.
Yeah, and I would add that I think it was a really smart move on the part of the administration to offer back in April the meeting between Biden and Putin, because it did seem to diffuse the crisis last time.
And it
Great.
also helped create a hostage. The administration then had something it could shoot.
Yeah.
Right. I want to talk about the range of options for policymakers here to in the matter. It's whether it's providing additional arms and training to Ukraine, preparing sanctions to impose in the event of Russian aggression, or stepping up diplomacy and taking a more assertive role in the Minsk process. Just what can people in Washington do to, either directly or just in terms of signaling? So Evelyn, why don't we turn to you first and then Steve?
So I like all of your options. So first of all, obviously, increased assistance, and let's get it over faster to Ukraine, and let's make it multi-dimensional, meaning, or multi-domain, meaning don't forget the maritime and the air components. Second, as you said, or maybe it's in the wrong order, but the Donbass negotiations, we should be at the table. I always, frankly, personally thought that we should be at the table, and the Europeans, I think, would welcome us at this point at the table. Third are the economic sanctions, and there's a lot more we can do. I mean, there's so much space between our sanctions on Russia, which are here, and our sanctions on Iran, you know, and I think threatening to take them off the SWIFT process, even maybe going back and looking retroactively at sovereign debt that's not new sovereign debt. I know that American companies wouldn't like that. There are American businesses that would pay the price, but frankly, we need our business community also to be backing our policy vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts?
I think there are things that the United States can and should be doing, both to bolster the deterrence of Russian action, but also to promote dialogue. On the deterrent side, yes, communicating political isolation. On the sanctions, it would be really valuable if the United States and Europe, who have already been talking about the sanctions, could actually agree on a pretty harsh list and then communicate that to the Kremlin, I'd say privately, and say, this is what happens. Again, the object should be to try to affect that cost benefit calculation that Putin is now conducting in the Kremlin. And then on military assistance, let's continue the military assistance. I think given the amount of money that the Congress is likely to provide, air defense gets really expensive really quickly, but maybe looking at niche capabilities, which I think would things like more javelins, more secure communications, counter battery radars, things that where we can help the Ukrainians fill niches that will improve their capability consistent with the amount of money that we're going to provide. So those are things that we can do on the deterrent side. But then on the dialogue side, yes, I think it's time for Washington to get more involved. But with the Europeans, with the Germans and the French, we don't want to displace them. We want to keep them involved in that, in part because the Europeans, their sanctions in some ways have greater impact on Russia than American sanctions, because Europe has far more economic and commercial interchange with Russia. And then again, I think, again, not just as a US-Russia dialogue, but in some broader format, you know, beginning some kind of a conversation on European security architecture, while recognizing that's going to be a long, difficult conversation. And it's very hard to see when you reach an endpoint that would be satisfactory to all the parties concerned, but at least start that dialogue.
Great. Steve, I was struck earlier when you addressed basically the demonstration effect within Russia that economically vibrant Ukraine would have. So let's kind of pivot to the economic sphere briefly and talk about what types of economic support the United States and the broader West can provide to Ukraine.
Well, I think the important thing on this one is, I mean, Ukraine has these two challenges. It's the Russia challenge, and it's a challenge of getting their economy right. You know, they can't solve Donbass without the Russians agreeing. The Russians have a veto. They can do a lot more, though, domestically. And I think it's less a matter of the kind of assistance the West is prepared to provide than it is of the Ukrainians finally taking some very difficult steps that would open up the economy. So it's things like curb the political and economic influence of the oligarchs. You know, these people don't want to have an open competitive economy because that's going to make it harder for them to reap in large profits. You've got to do that, though, if you want to have a successful growing economy. It's continue to further press against corruption, and it's got to be applied in an even-handed way. But the message has to be: if you engage in corruption, there will be consequences. And for 30 years, people have not seen a lot of consequences. They've got to come up with how they handle a court system where I believe many of the judges are corrupt or compromised. And the problem there is, constitutionally, it's very hard for the executive branch to fix that. But there are things that they can and should be doing in parallel with dealing with this threat from Russia that could open up the economy, could get things growing in a way that would be good both for rising living standards, but also would contribute to a more resilient state, better able to resist Russian pressure.
Evelyn, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's the key to Ukraine really solidifying its own independent state. If Ukraine wants to maintain its sovereignty, then it needs to really embrace and turn away from the kleptocratic economic system, embrace an open, quote unquote, liberal economy, competitive economy, and certainly to eliminate corruption. Corruption is the thing that lets Russia in the door. Frankly speaking, it's been what let Russia in the door into the US political system as well.
Sure. One place where this broader debate is manifesting itself up on Capitol Hill is in the NDAA specifically, is when it comes to Nord Stream 2. So, there are certain senators up there saying that it's a threat to European energy security, also would cut revenues for Ukraine. So, Steve, being former ambassador in Kyiv, can you just tell me how you see this, how you see Nord Stream 2 playing into all this?
Yeah.
Broader European energy security situation?
Yeah, from the point of view of Europe, I think Nord Stream 2 has an exaggerated importance. The fact is, if we could snap our fingers and make that pipeline disappear tomorrow, it's not going to affect European dependence on Russian gas. Europe still needs the gas. And the fact is that there is now more than enough pipeline capacity without Nord Stream 2 to move gas from Russia to Europe. So the factor, though, that I get concerned about because of Ukraine is, for Moscow, one of the driving motivations for Nord Stream 2 was to be able to move gas around Ukraine to Europe. And right now, Gazprom has a contract to continue moving gas, I think at the rate of 40 billion cubic meters a year through Ukraine up and through 2024. Or at least, if not move that, they have to pay the Ukrainians at least for that minimum amount. I think the Russians would like to be able to end that after 2024. That would do two things to Ukraine. One is it would cut off transit revenues of about $1 to $1.5 billion per year. But perhaps more importantly, the way Ukraine now uses, remember the pipe systems that move transit gas through Ukraine are the same pipes that actually distribute gas within Ukraine. And a lot of gas that comes into Ukraine from Russia as transit gas actually gets consumed in eastern Ukraine, and the Ukrainians then replace it with gas they produce in western Ukraine. So the same amount of gas comes out on the western end, but what it allows the Ukrainians to do is manage their domestic gas distribution in a much more efficient way, generally moving from east to west, as opposed to a situation where they might have to be moving gas in both directions. And that would drive up their costs. And again, from the Russians' point of view, causing higher costs to Ukrainian consumers is probably not a bad thing. So it'll be interesting to see. The Germans have said fairly adamantly that there will be Russian gas moving through Ukraine after 2024. I hope that's right, but I'm not quite sure how we can force that, given that with Nord Stream 2, there's going to be enough capacity for the Russians going through the Baltic, going through Turk Stream across the Black Sea to meet their gas demand to Europe and really turn off the gas going into Ukraine.
Great. Evelyn, do you have any thoughts on energy security and Nord Stream 2 specifically?
I agree with everything Steve said, and I would only add that the German government, it bears watching to see what the German government's going to do, because as we all know, there was just a major transition politically in Germany. The chancellor left after 16 plus years in power. And she was the one who gave the nod, sort of surprisingly from my perspective, but basically to the German business interests to continue with Nord Stream 2. But the Greens are in coalition now, and they are adamantly opposed to Nord Stream 2. So we'll see. I think it really remains to be seen, and a lot depends on how the Russians behave.
Right. No, it'll certainly be interesting to watch the coalition politics in Germany and how this plays out, particularly with the rise of the Greens and them being in coalition. Steve, I want to pose this to you.
And they'll have the foreign ministry.
Right, of course. Steve, I want to pose this to you and ask you just your insights on this. And it's a name that's dropped kind of almost off the cuff by President Zelensky, and that is Rinat Akhmedov. And forgive me if I've mispronounced his name, but Zelensky said that he suspected he was going to be involved in some way, shape, or form with a Russian fomented coup. Who is this individual, and why does Zelensky single him out?
Yeah, no, Rinat Akhmedov is the richest oligarch in Ukraine now. Although I think the greater concerns have been expressed over the last couple of years about another oligarch, Ihor Kolomoisky, because Kolomoisky had links to Zelensky when Zelensky was a television comedian. He was on Kolomoisky's television channel. But so far, it looks to me like Zelensky's done a fairly good job of not being influenced by Kolomoisky. But Akhmedov is the richest oligarch. There have been questions going back to 2014 and 2015 about what dealings he might have with Russians and/or the so-called authorities and what the self-proclaimed Donetsk peoples and Luhansk people's republics, because a lot of the industrial interests of Akhmedov were located in what is now the occupied part of Donbass. So there are always sort of questions, how he was dealing there. And I'm not sure how deeply he's been engaged in that. I think a lot of people, myself included, were surprised by this reported story about a possible coup. I mean, I certainly would not exclude it, and I would not exclude the Russians looking to do something to undermine Zelensky, but I don't think we've seen yet enough information in public to come to a firm conclusion. I mean, to be sure, I think, again, one of the factors, and this may be a factor behind the current pressure, is the Russians really did not like Zelensky's predecessor, Petro Poroshenko.
Mm-hmm.
And when Zelensky came into office, there was, I think, a certain expectation or a belief in Moscow. We have this new guy, he's green, he's not very experienced. He says his number one priority is to end the fighting. Maybe this creates some opportunities. And actually, Zelensky proved to be a tougher interlocutor than I think the Russians expected. And the Russians may be getting concerned now. Zelensky, who I believe looked at things like NATO with a certain degree of ambivalence when he came to office back in 2019, is now, having been impacted by 2 years as president under Russian pressure, this continued Russian low-intensity war against Ukraine. He's now talking about, we should be in NATO. Maybe the Russians have, given up on the possibility that they could cut a deal with Zelensky, but looking at the way the Russians have behaved, they're going to have a really hard time finding any leader in Kyiv who comes to power by a democratic path, or even by some alternative means, a leader who can somehow turn around and bring Ukraine back into Moscow's orbit. Russia's just done too much damage to that relationship in the last 7 years.
I guess we are nearly out of time, but I guess, Evelyn, I want to pose a closing question to you, and it ties in what Steve was just talking about, but also ties in the article Putin published earlier this summer, and it is just Putin's intentions. In your view, does he have territorial intentions, or is he just simply seeking to change the Ukrainian government and impose more pro-Russian political actors?
I think what is different from, let's say, Hitler, in the kind of 20th century form of revanchism, is that it doesn't have to be controlling the territory physically. So Putin was perfectly happy having Yanukovych in power and getting what he wanted, extracting economic and political concessions from Ukraine through their leader. The problem is, of course, as Steve just pointed out, that's not looking like a possibility. So that's why he's using the military to try to put pressure on the political situation. I think the Russians still believe, ideally, the better way to achieve control over Ukraine is not to invade and, seize the whole country, but actually to, invade as little as you need to get the political system to collapse and to get the Ukrainian government to capitulate.
Yeah, if Moscow could have a Ukraine that was aligned with Russia in the way that I think Belarus now is under Lukashenko, they'd be quite satisfied. But they're not going to get that. I mean, again, and largely, this is what a result of Russia's strategic failure over the last 7 years. When I was in Ukraine at the end of the 1990s, I would say there was a group of Ukrainian nationalists in the western part of the country primarily who were very strongly anti-Russian. But for a lot of the Ukrainian people, they were, they had either, good feelings or were ambivalent about Russia. That's changed. I think there's a degree of hostility among Ukrainians now towards the Russian government, not the Russian people, but towards the Russian government that wasn't there 20 years ago. And it's going to take decades to overcome that. And that's a specific result of the Putin policy of the last 7 years towards Ukraine.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, just as somebody who witnessed the Ukrainians responding in 2014 to what the Russians had done in that moment, it was a trauma for them. I mean, they felt really betrayed. And that sense of betrayal really fed the nationalism that exists today.
Great. Well, we've gone a couple of minutes over, so apologies for that. I usually try and start and end on time, but you've provided us with a really deep dive on what's going on today, the sources of Russian conduct, if I can borrow a phrase, and what to look forward to in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Evelyn, Steve, I really appreciate you taking the time to engage in conversation. I hope our audience got something out of it and that this helped shed some light on what is an extremely fluid and volatile situation on the Ukrainian frontier. So again, my appreciation to you both. That's all we have for today until we can reconvene again and hopefully start to reconvene these meetings in person. Everybody stay well.
Thanks, Patrick. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Guys. It was fun.